I'll be with you in just a moment. All right. The treasure we found. I know many of you have been following the Lord for a long time. And perhaps I would say, hopefully, you have experienced a relationship with God that you just wish you could give to other people, right? The experience of a greater purpose, of forgiveness, divine forgiveness, of hope for a certainty after this life, of having God right there to converse with at any time, to be a comfort and a help and a very real friend. And all of these things that are part of having a relationship with God, part of the results of the good news, what we call the gospel, and you just want to give that to other people. Let me ask this question. Who in your life do you want to give it to? Who in your life do you want to influence with the gospel to say, man, this has changed my life, and I so wish that so-and-so could experience this? I want to encourage you to do something, if you would. There in your bulletin, there is a page of notes for you to follow along with the message. And maybe at the top of your notes somewhere, you could scribble some little initials or shorthand to identify who are some of those people in your life that you just think, man, I so wish that they could have what I have. And maybe it's, particular person or a group of people that you really care about, or whoever it is in your life that you would like to share the good news with. So write some little initials on there. The fact is that we are often at a loss of where to start. How do we influence? What do we say? Where do we begin? How do we approach this? We don't want to bother people or offend or put strain on the relationship, or we don't want to be stumped when they have questions we can't answer, or there might be a variety of things that go through our minds. Well, it turns out that the Apostle Paul, this was his sweet spot. He was very good at sharing and helping people grasp and understand the good news about Jesus. And when we return now to the book of Galatians, we were looking at this before Easter. We took a break for a couple of weeks, and now we're back. We return to this section of Galatians in chapter 4, verses 12 to 20. I invite you to turn there in your Bibles, if you have a Bible with you. In this little section, it's kind of a parenthesis in Paul's argument, so to speak, in his letter. And in here we get a window into Paul's approach. A window into the way that the Apostle Paul influenced people with the best news in the world. So here's a quick context to catch us up. We've been in Galatians for several weeks, but we've taken a break. So the thing that was happening, the reason he wrote this letter, is that Paul had gone to this area in a Gentile region, Galatia. He shared the good news about Jesus. Several people accepted that message about Jesus. They came into a new relationship with God, and church was formed, and they started practicing their faith together. And later, at some time, a group came from Jerusalem and really swayed them away from that pure, simple good news to convince them that, well, to be right with God, you have to also do these other things. You have to also follow the Mosaic law, for example. And so this whole letter that Paul writes is to kind of correct that way of thinking and call them back to the simple gospel. And Paul's main point throughout this letter can be, I think, summarized in chapter 2, verse 15, when he says, a person is not justified, is not made right or declared right with God by works of the law. Not by doing anything, but through faith in Jesus Christ. And so most of the first 4 chapters of this letter are painting this contrast between being right with God through faith alone, which he says this is, how it actually works, as opposed to this way of thinking that says, what do I need to do to get what I want from God? And there's all kinds of forms that takes, but it's a basic fallacy, even though that's how tons and tons of people approach God, approach religion. What do I need to do to get what I want from God? Paul says it doesn't even work that way. Being right with God is a gift that we receive through faith. And so in this parentheses in verses 12 to 20, he shifts for a moment from this kind of doctrinal reasoning and illustrating to a personal appeal. One commentator simply points out that this passage that we're going to look at now provides a window into the pastoral heart of Paul, into kind of this shepherding disposition of the apostle. And when we open that window, we see that above all, gospel influence is relational. I think that is a good way to summarize his whole example in this whole section. And when we get our minds around that, it affects our approach, of how we share this good news with people. And it also, I believe, affects our expectations, our thoughts and ideas and assumptions about what's going to happen when we talk about Jesus. So this morning we'll look at 6 lessons from Paul's example in this text. But first, I just want you to listen to the passage being read and see if you can kind of glimpse into some things we could learn from Paul along the way.
This is from the New Living Translation. Dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to live as I do in freedom from these things, for I have become like you Gentiles, free from those laws. You did not mistreat me when I first preached to you. Surely you remember that I was sick when I first brought you the good news. But even though my condition tempted you to reject me, you did not despise me or turn me away. No, you took me in and cared for me as though I were an angel from God, or even Christ Jesus himself. Where is that joyful and grateful spirit you felt then? I am sure you would have taken out your own eyes and given them to me if it had been possible. Have I now become your enemy because I'm telling you the truth? Those false teachers are so eager to win your favor, but their intentions are not good. They are trying to shut you off from me so that you will pay attention only to them. If someone is eager to do good things for you, that's all right, but let them do it all the time, not just when I'm with you. Oh, my dear children, I feel as if I'm going through labor pains for you again, and they will continue until Christ is fully developed in your lives. I wish I were with you right now so I could change my tone. But at this distance, I don't know how else to help you.
So honestly, as I started looking at this passage, it's a little bit strange, and the lessons were not obvious. And as I spent more time in it, it just started, kind of leaping off the page of this beautiful example of how to do this well. How to talk about the treasure that we have found. So what does it mean to adopt this relational approach to gospel influence? Here's six lessons from Paul. First of all, gospel influence is accommodating. It's accommodating. Verse 12 says, brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. Well, first of all, you can see just how relational this is when he calls them brothers or brothers and sisters. From the very first word, it's very familial, it's personal. But he says, become as I am, follow my example. And we see Paul using this language in several of his letters that he's written to other people in churches. But here, the emphasis, or the reason he gives, is this: become as I am, for I also have become as you are. So, Paul grew up in a very strictly religious sect. Um, he spent his life up till, recently before he wrote this letter, um, being just, well, I'm going to say religiously following, that's the true word, the meaning of that word, religiously following the Mosaic law plus all of the traditions from his strain of Judaism. All of it. His life was just built around, intertwined in all that he did. How he ate, who he hung out with, how he ordered his day, what he did and didn't do. It was all dictated by this religious system. That's what he knew. When he came to a relationship with God through Jesus, he shifted his whole way of viewing life up till that point of time. So much so that when he came to share his life and his message with the Galatians, he says, I became as you are. He made this huge leap of becoming like the Galatians, letting go of all the religious assumptions and ways that he had practiced his faith beforehand. He held those very loosely, and so when he came to spend time with the Galatians, he would eat things he didn't eat before. he would go into people's homes that he maybe wouldn't go into before. He would share things and do things in ways that would have been totally different than how he had practiced his faith before. Tim Keller's Bible study commentary on this passage calls what Paul's doing here as being culturally flexible. He goes into this new area and doesn't immediately say, to follow Jesus, you have to do it all like I've been doing it, but he watches and listens and asks questions and does this huge amount of shifting and bending over to say, what can I do to do things and accept things and welcome things that these people are doing outside of doing something that the New Testament says is against God's laws, God's instructions. Well, this is what Paul did when he came and brought the message there, and this is the very thing that the Jerusalem legalists would have called completely scandalous. There's one way to practice following Jesus, and it includes all these things. So Keller calls it culturally flexible. The legalists call it scandalous. And I think what Paul calls it, as we see in 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, he calls it being free to adapt to save as many as possible. We don't have time to really go to that passage today, but this is what it's all about. Paul's saying that he is free to adapt to save as many as possible. This is not about compromising clear New Testament instructions, but it's releasing our grip on all the peripheral rules and routines and rituals that we've become accustomed to in the way that we practice our faith in order to better enter the world of those we want to love and share the good news with. Well, some of that sounds good on paper until we start, deciding what's on that list and what's not, and start making us very, very uncomfortable. But just think about the people that maybe you jotted on the top of your notes, or just that come to mind, that you think about them and you just say, I wish so much that they had what I have in this beautiful relationship with God through Jesus. Think about those people, and then think, what can you do to better accommodate? Maybe it's trying their hobby. Maybe it's being in their homes. Maybe it's having them in your home. Maybe it's, listening to their stories without just immediately judging them. um, Eating their food. Well, I'll eat probably pretty much anybody's food, but there's ways we can accommodate. We could be open in our hearts to the world of the people that we'd like to share Jesus' love with. This is something we all need to do just individually. But we also need to do this as a church. How can we be accommodating as a church, but with zero compromise? Our leadership has been prayerfully just looking at how we do things here, evaluating everything from what our programs look like to the name of the church, and just all these things. We're just saying, Lord, how can we remove barriers and bridge the gap between people who just don't even know what we're about, and maybe they wouldn't even walk in here or whatever. How do we accommodate? Well, when we start asking those kind of questions, the Jerusalem legalists would say, stop that. That's scandalous. But Paul, I think, would say, this is being free to adapt to save as many as possible, right? Does that sound fun or does that sound scary? You don't have to say it out loud. Just ponder that. So, in a relational approach to gospel influence, we need to be accommodating. Secondly, we see in this passage that gospel influence is reciprocal. This is kind of an interesting concept. Verse 13, Paul says, he goes back, he's talking about when he first spent time with them and he first came to share the gospel. Verse 13 says, it was because of a bodily ailment that I preached the gospel to you at first. So perhaps he had other plans. He was going to head somewhere else with the gospel. There's all kinds of speculation about Paul's itinerary and what he was up to. But because of this bodily ailment, some kind of sickness or weakness of some kind, that is what God used to put him in Galatia at that time. And verse 14 says, and though my condition was a trial to you, you did not scorn or despise me, but received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus. So when Paul came to Galatia, he was sickly. Some unnamed but obvious malady. And people have some ideas about what that could have been, but he doesn't clearly describe it. But it was something that he says was a burden or a trial to the Galatians. So here Paul is reaching out to these people with the good news about Jesus and ends up receiving care from them. It's really a little counterintuitive. He humbled himself to receive from the very people that he is he's sharing the love of Jesus with. Thinking of the people on your list, do you need to be more vulnerable with them? Do you need to accept help from people? Or do you approach your gospel message as one who has it all together, has the answers, has the resources, life's great, and also here's Jesus? Well, all we really have is Jesus. Our lives are all different levels of greatness and togetherness, but we have a life-changing message. Sometimes, I think especially in foreign missions, there's this tendency to come in with all the answers, all the resources, and the message about Jesus, and kind of it's a big package, and here you go. We need to just be honest about our weaknesses. Could it be that it's your brokenness and not your managed image that opens hearts to the good news about Jesus? We definitely want to sacrifice and labor for the sake of the good news, but we also need to just be honest about our own limitations and even just be open to help from people that don't share your faith. So, kind of a interesting little comment that Paul puts in here, and I think it's about this idea of being reciprocal. We we are humble enough to receive, even while we are dedicated to give. So, gospel influence is accommodating, it's reciprocal, and third, gospel influence is truthful. Okay? This is important. Verse 16, he says, "Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth?" We used to be such good buddies. I told you about Jesus, you accepted it, and then you were swayed from that, adding all these legalistic things, and now the Galatians have this coldness toward Paul, and he says, "Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth?" So clearly, we see, putting these together, that accommodation does not mean the same thing as don't offend at any cost, right? Because at the heart of the gospel is a truth claim that a person is made right with God only through faith in Jesus. And for some, that's kind of an assault at our own pride. I have my own system for reaching out to God, or can't it work this way? And the simple gospel message about a relationship with God through faith in Jesus can be offensive. But when the gospel influence is relational, it's built on actual care for actual people. When we really care, we need to really speak the truth, right? So there's timing and there's sensitivities, etc. But we can't shy away from telling people how to find the treasure that we have found, right? Accommodating, reciprocal, truthful, and fourth, gospel influence is genuine. It's genuine. There's this, I mentioned this passage is kind of strange, but this is probably the strangest part. Just kind of hard to unravel exactly what he's talking about in verses 17 and 18. So I'll read it and then just comment a little. He says about these Jerusalem legalists, he says, "They make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that you may make much of them. It's always good to be made much of for a good purpose, and not only when I am present with you." So this word that in the ESV is "make much of," your version might say something else. It's basically the word to be zealous, kind of worked up, passionate about something, and it can be used in the sense of to flatter or to win over, to promote. Even it's sometimes used to talk about courting a woman, and so it's this word about influence, but it can be not genuine. Make much of. Just because the world we live in today is one giant commercial doesn't mean that's how the gospel works, right? It's the Great Commission, not the great ad campaign, right? These are very, very different things. Gospel influence is not about hype. It's not about PR. It's not about persuasive tactics. It's not about having polished programs. It's not about any of these things. It's real people introducing real people to Jesus out of real love. So let's not make it something else, even if that's just basically how the world works these days. Being zealous to influence apart from this genuine desire for the best for the other person, this zealousness apart from genuine care for another person is really nothing more than like salesmanship, right? Or or worse. It's manipulation, um, coercion, etc. That's not how people come into a true relationship with God through Jesus. Um, with that said, you kind of put this as an aside. The world speaks the language of polished image. Perhaps more now than ever, all the AI and airbrushing and, imaging that we do to present things a certain way, and all the, ad campaigns and everything. That's the language our culture speaks. And so, to a degree, I think we could call it a form of accommodating to learn that language. It's not having things that are totally shoddy at the church. Having a decent website, and cleaning up the place, and having programs that aren't a train wreck. There there are reasons that we want to do things sharp, to speak the language of the people. But in doing so, we need to remember that the Great Commission is not a promotional effort. It's real people introducing real people to Jesus out of real love in authentic, honest interactions. Well, here is the problem when we start talking about real people and real love and being genuine, is that it's messy, right? It opens us up to heartache. It opens us up to real relational dynamics that can be complicated or uncomfortable. And we learn this was very much the experience of the Apostle Paul. The fifth, we see gospel influence. It's heavy. We're talking about, we found treasure. We found a relationship with God that goes on from this life into the next. And we want to share that super badly with those we love. And a lot of times they don't necessarily want that. Or they follow the Lord for a while and then they don't. And all of this, when it's personal, it becomes heavy. Here's how Paul says it, verse 19. My little children. Some of you have had children. They started out little, right? My little children, for whom I am again in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. So Paul describes his ministry and interaction with the Galatians as parental love. My little babies. If you've parented, you've probably experienced some kind of heartache. Probably some other kind of aches too, but including heartache. These Galatians had initially responded to the gospel. Now they're being influenced away to some kind of legalism. And Paul says, this feels like I'm going through labor a second time. So I have not been through labor, but I've watched it a few times. It looks hard. Can anybody testify that it is hard? Okay, I see several of you could testify that. This curious little way that Paul describes it is his relationship with the Galatians was like going through labor a second time. So those of you who said it's hard, imagine that twice for the same kid. He says, this is how I feel right now about you. There's heartache. Gospel influence, it's not detached. We can put a bumper sticker on our car that says, Jesus is awesome or whatever, and that's gospel influence. Well, that's completely detached. It's just sitting there. You could leave gospel tracts places. You can drop gospel tracts from a drone, whatever. These are all, these do not, I'm not going to say they don't count, but these are all detached ways that are not relationally invested. And when we are relationally invested, we can anticipate that sometimes sharing our heart on these things will be heavy. Is there someone in your life who's kind of pushed back or rejected the hope that you have? Or maybe they've walked away from it and it feels heavy? This is a good sign that you are loving genuinely. If you felt some heaviness, if you rarely, if ever, experience some heaviness like this, then we need to call out to the Lord to say, God, help me love people more, that I might feel some of that heaviness. So, gospel influence is accommodating, reciprocal, truthful, genuine, heavy. And finally, verse 20, gospel influence is perplexing. It's what he says. He says, I wish I could be present with you and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. I just don't get what's going on. I'm so confused. This is so, I don't understand it. When real people are involved, not numbers or statistics or whatever, it's real perplexing, right? You ever been perplexed as you live out your faith and share your faith, and you get just super seemingly random responses to that? Sometimes completely unexpected people believe. Sometimes what seems like the most likely candidate, they're just like one step away from totally following Jesus, they reject. Sometimes the faithful walk away. Sometimes the unfaithful have complete changes of hearts. Sometimes the faithful will stumble multiple times and then all of a sudden start thriving. Well, none of this should really surprise us, right? Because we're talking about real people, not statistics or numbers, etc. We did about 15 years of youth ministry. Super fun. If I would have placed bets on which of these students was going to go on to totally live for the Lord and which are not, well, I probably would have lost money, right? Because we have ideas about how things will turn out, but real people are perplexing. Years ago, Heather and I went to a fundraiser for a big ministry that had, they were promoting a tool for sharing the gospel in different places. And a comment that was made has just stuck with me through the years. And they said something like, for every X dollars you give, like 3 people will turn their lives to Jesus. I'm like, that's weird. I'm not sure it works that way. I mean, maybe if they've taken all the responses so far, that's what's happened so far. Real people, I think, are far more perplexing than that. I'm more perplexing than that. You probably are too. Well, people are not so predictable, so we shouldn't be so surprised when that hard-hearted, super grouchy neighbor just receives Jesus with tears. We shouldn't be so perplexed when the child from the loving Christian home, walks away from the faith. We'll have heartache, but it shouldn't be perplexing. When the elderly believer who half-heartedly kind of followed God sort of for decades, then all of a sudden they got super on fire for the Lord. That shouldn't be perplexing. People do things that, from our perspective, don't make sense. And this was certainly the case in Paul's experience. He's like, man, you people in Galatia, I cannot understand what is going on. And we might feel that way too, because we're talking about real people, because gospel influence is relational. And in a relationship, you only control your side, right? Some of us have tried to control both sides in various kinds of relationships in our lives, and that never really goes well. So let's just return one more time to those people that you have in your mind that you think, man, I so wish that they had what I have. I so wish that they had this hope that I have, this inner joy, this peace that passes, regular kind of understanding. I so wish these people would give their lives to Jesus. So with that list of people in mind, what's one shift you could make toward a more relational approach? I'm just going to throw these up there again, a summary. I know I got a lot of points today, 6. Throw those up there and let us kind of think about in our own relationships, people that we love and care for and rub shoulders with, maybe in our homes, maybe we work with or in clubs with or neighbors with or whatever. Gospel influence is accommodating. Is there some way you need to flex and enter into the world of another? Reciprocal. Is there somebody in your life that you need to stop pretending you have it all together and be more vulnerable with them? Truthful. Do you have relationships where it's time to actually say something clearly about the good news? Genuine. Can you be more honest and open and invested? Looking at your motives, not so you could say like, hey, I got one to, come to church or whatever, but out of this deep love, like, man, God, you've done this for me. I'd love to see that person experience it. Maybe you need to open yourself to the heaviness of working with, when we're talking about real people here. And maybe you need to, as you look at the people in your lives, stop being so surprised, because real people are unpredictable. They are perplexing. So, in a short phrase, let's get personal with the gospel, with the good news. Let's make it relational and not something else. So, in a moment, we'll take some time to, you'll have an opportunity to pray with somebody near you. No pressure to. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment, but right now, let me say a quick prayer to start us off. God, help us genuinely love people toward a genuine relationship with you. Amen. Well, this is how I envision this going. I know whenever we do something new, it's a little awkward, but just roll with it. So if you could just find maybe 1 or 2 people near you, just kind of scooch together, or maybe you're already, came with somebody, they're sitting next to you. And if you're comfortable, just as you're comfortable, share 1 or maybe 2 things on this list that you would just like the other person to pray for you for. And then just take turns, each saying a prayer for the other person. Totally fine if that's beyond your comfort level to say, I'm just going to pass. Or I'll pray quietly, silently and not out loud. That's fine. But in any case, get with somebody else, and as you're comfortable, share 1 of these ways, maybe 2, that you would like that other person to pray for you. Pray that you would be, more accommodating, more, flexible to enter into the world of those who need Jesus. Be more reciprocal in this openness to help and vulnerability about, our actual weaknesses. Maybe you would like prayer just to be more truthful, courage to speak more clearly about the hope that you found. Or maybe your prayer is to be more genuine and not so detached about the ways that you share your faith. Perhaps your prayer is to be more caring so you feel the heaviness of real people in your life. Or 6, maybe your prayer is to be more just accepting of the perplexity of real people and turn that over to the Lord. Or perhaps I squeezed the number 7 on there, just barely fit, but perhaps for you, you're just kind of uncertain about your relationship with God at all, and you'd just like that other person just to pray for you in whatever way that you ask them to. We will in a moment play a song, and during that one song, I invite you get near somebody, share something off that list, say a prayer for each other, either out loud or silently, and then I will come and close us with a prayer at the end of that song. Everyone's good? You got it. You're a sharp crowd.